RWBY is a franchise that takes a lot of its inspiration from classical fairy tales, with some sprinklings of history, mythology, and even occasionally pop culture thrown in for good measure. Every main character in the show is a reference to an iconic figure from our world, with some occasional exceptions. The most obvious references are, of course, the four main characters. Ruby is Little Red Riding Hood, Weiss is Snow White, Blake is Belle from Beauty and the Beast, and Yang is Goldilocks. Even the heart of the show's conflict, the battle between Salem and Ozpin, takes inspiration from Baum's The Wizard of Oz. However, looking back over the show's roster of characters, I've come to something of a realization. The inspiration from these sources tends to be rather inconsistent. Some members of RWBY's cast have their entire designs, personalities, backstories, and even powers based off of their cultural influence, while others use it as little more than a surface level detail at best. To clarify, I don't necessarily think one is inherently better than the other, but it becomes a lot more noticeable when you start to compare and contrast. For example, let's take two characters introduced in Volume 1, Penny Polendina and Velvet Scarlatina. Penny is based on Pinocchio. She's an android girl created by an old man with the intent of being Remnant's first artificial human. As one would expect, her character arc is centered around learning what it actually means to be human, with the end goal being to become a quote-unquote real girl, just as Pinocchio longed to be a real boy. Beyond the parallels of their backstories and motivations, however, there are also some subtler connections to be made. Pinocchio's nose is known for elongating when he tells a lie, while Penny has a built-in quirk that makes her hiccup when she's dishonest. Also, her weapons are a bunch of blades that she controls with strings, a clever nod to Pinocchio's origin as a puppet. Penny even gets to transform into a real girl thanks to the aid of a magical blue entity, before being unceremoniously killed off, but we won't get into that. Now, take all of that and contrast it with Velvet, a character based on the Velveteen Rabbit. This children's tale by Marjorie Williams tells the story of a stuffed rabbit gifted to a young boy as a Christmas present. The rabbit becomes the boy's favorite toy, which he loves and cherishes above all others. Eventually, though, the boy contracts scarlet fever. Though he survives the ordeal, the doctor suggests that he be taken on a seaside vacation while all his belongings are disinfected, i.e., burned to avoid the risk of the disease spreading. The rabbit is one of these items set to be burned, though is saved from incineration by the intervention of a fairy. She declares that he has become real to the boy, so the fairy makes the toy rabbit real to everyone by turning him into an actual rabbit and allowing him to live in the woods near the boy's home. Velvet Scarlatina possesses basically none of that as a part of her character. Aside from her name being a reference to the Velveteen Rabbit, as well as scarlet fever, and the fact that she's a rabbit faunus, there's really no parallels to be drawn here. She wasn't a doll brought to life, she has no connection to any sickly children that we know of, and there's no magic at play with her. You can maybe make an argument that Velvet's semblance and weapon, which allow her to mimic the fighting styles of others, could be tied into the idea that the Velveteen Rabbit mimics a real rabbit, but that feels like a stretch. Now, admittedly, Velvet is a relatively minor character in RWBY's admittedly overinflated cast, but you can still see what I'm getting at, right? Both she and Penny are based on remarkably similar fairy tales about inanimate toys gaining souls through the love of their owners, and being brought to life by fairies. In spite of that, Penny lifts almost her entire character from the source material, while Velvet feels almost entirely disconnected to it with only vague allusions. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that Velvet should have been a doll brought to life in the show, but I do think there was missed potential to do something more interesting with her than what we got, especially since she's a favorite of both the fans and the creators. Like, Velvet's whole thing in the first 3 volumes is being timid and reserved, right? Despite being shown to be a capable fighter, she doesn't much care for conflict, even allowing herself to be bullied by Cardan. It's strange that such a meek individual would sign up to become a huntress and fight monsters for a living, don't you think? Well, what if there was a deeper reason for that? Maybe we could say that Velvet was adopted into a human family, and despite her shyness, grew really close with her new baby brother. One day, the brother gets sick, and that sickness only worsens with time. The treatments become more and more expensive, and it won't be long before the family can't even afford to take care of him. To repay the kindness of her adopted family and help her new brother, Velvet decides to become a huntress, figuring the money that she could earn from slaying Grimm might be enough to afford her brother's continued treatment. I think this does a decent job of mirroring the source material while still allowing Velvet to be her own thing. A rabbit brought into a loving human family, a young child who develops a deep bond with her, the sickness, and the love that persists even after the rabbit has left her home. All of it's there, but could be given its own unique twist in the world of Remnant. But let's move on and analyze some other characters from RWBY, shall we? As mentioned before, this show takes a lot of inspiration from The Wizard of Oz. And indeed, Dorothy's 3 iconic companions are all present as well, to varying extents. Ironwood is meant to represent the Tin Man, a robot created without a heart. Ironwood mirrors this by being a cyborg who thinks logically instead of emotionally, something that drives him towards villainous actions in later volumes. Leonardo Lionheart, of course, is the Cowardly Lion, a mighty beast with a timid nature. Leo mirrors this by being, well, cowardly, and a lion faunus. Lastly, Crow Branwyn is meant to stand in for the Scarecrow, whose whole thing is being barely intelligent enough to be considered a living creature, and his quest is to obtain a quote-unquote brain. Crow, well, he's kinda lanky, I guess, like a scarecrow. And he's often drunk, which I guess could be seen as a parallel for the Scarecrow's stupidity. Yeah, again, these 3 have mostly surface level parallels at best. Lionheart is the most direct and blatant. Though unlike the lion in The Wizard of Oz, he betrays the heroes to serve the Wicked Witch, only to be killed by her once he no longer proved useful. Ironwood's only real connection to the Tin Man is being heartless, which leads him to also betraying the heroes as well. At the very least, this seems to set up a theme that the RWBY counterparts of Dorothy's companions will wind up being antagonists. Rather than overcoming their individual flaws of stupidity, heartlessness, and cowardice, these flaws wind up turning them into villains, right? Well, as I said, the pattern is somewhat broken by Crow. Not only is he not particularly stupid, in fact, his flaw is more so his bad luck semblance than a lack of intelligence, Crow is also pretty staunchly on the good guy's side throughout the entire show. There was an opportunity to have him possibly turn after Ozpin's revelation in Volume 6, perhaps deceived by another antagonist by being made to think there was a way to stop or kill Salem, but obviously that never happened. I mean, don't get me wrong, I like Crow. He's one of my favorite characters. But I can't deny that he also takes the least inspiration from his source material out of the 3. Lastly, let's talk about Sun Wukong, a character based on Sun Wukong. Yeah, this guy isn't even remotely subtle. Like, the Monkey King might be one of the most referenced characters in all of fiction, to the point that he kind of overshadows everyone and everything else in Journey to the West. And RWBY's version is pretty upfront about its inspiration. He is a monkey faunus who fights with an extending staff, and his semblance is the ability to summon clones of himself. Sun's personality is generally pretty carefree and even mischievous, but he has a good heart and is quick to rush to the aid of his friends. All in all, while I think just taking the name outright might have been a little too on the nose, I can't deny that RWBY did a pretty decent job of adapting the idea of Sun Wukong into the world of Remnant. So what is my point with all this? Well, as I said, it really comes down to the fact that RWBY's references to real-world culture feel rather inconsistent. You have some characters whose entire personalities, arcs, and even names are directly lifted from their source material, while others don't really use their real-world inspirations for anything more than surface-level references. You've got Pyrrha, a character based on Achilles, dying in a desperate last stand after being shot in the heel. But I don't anticipate that Jean, a character named after Jeanne d'Arc, is going to be executed on false charges given where his character has gone. Again, I'm not saying that everyone in RWBY needs to just retell the same basic stories as the characters they're based off of. If anything, that would make the show's plot a little too predictable. I'm only saying that the show's use of historical, mythological, and cultural references varies wildly between characters, and I think some members of the cast suffered for it as a result. But what do you all think? Do you wish RWBY had taken more inspiration from the real world? Less? Or do you think it's fine as is? Leave your thoughts and comments down below, and until next time, stay bright.